It's lovely to be here. I was first asked 2 or 3 years ago, and then the sky fell in, so I couldn't come. I should explain that, hang on, let me see if I can get this gadget to work. I'm going to be talking to you about horses in the First World War. And my disqualifications are two. One is that I had no close relatives that I knew in any detail who were in the military at that time. And I wasn't alive in the First World War. I never got the hang of horse riding. I did try horse riding, but I never got the hang of a rising trot, so I cannot claim to be a horse rider. So with those two disclaimers of no close relation to the military, no ability to ride horses, I am going to talk to you about military history of horses. I'm going to talk about the background, about horses, about the camp, particularly the one in Romsey, the men who worked there, and what happened afterwards. And I'm going to concentrate on the remount depot at Romsey, but just bear in mind that it was only one of many. What I am not going to do is to discuss the role of animals at the front. If you want to know about those, go and see the film or the play War Horse. I'm only talking here about their acquisition and preparation. One of the things I think it's easy to forget in this century is the importance of horses in warfare. World War I was probably the last war in which they were of major importance. And the 1914-18 war represents a cusp upon which the military was changing from the age-old reliance on animals to mechanical means of traction. That said, horses were still being used extensively in the Second World War. For example, the Germans used 60,000 horses when they invaded Russia in 1941. But the emphasis, nonetheless, had shifted to internal combustion, tanks and lorries, and in continental Europe, railways. Even in 1914, horses were playing a much smaller role in civilian life than had been the case a decade before. This was most conspicuous in the case of light draft horses. These are the animals used for pulling the vans of retail delivery men, butchers, bakers, milkmen and the like. And they were being replaced in large numbers by motorised vans. Now, the remount service, and I don't know why it's called remount, so don't ask, was established by the British Army in 1887 to provide horses for military use, and they thought they'd need about 16 horses a year for all branches of the army except cavalry officers' chargers, which remained a personal responsibility. The headquarters of the remount service was at Woolwich, but after the Boer War, 2 more depots were established, one at Arborfield near Reading and the other at Melton Mowbray. Now, the South African War at the turn of the century acted very much as a dress rehearsal for the First World War, and this was particularly the case for the remount service. On the outbreak of hostilities, it was thought that the garrison would need some 7,000 additional horses and 9,000 mules. But in the event, the remount service provided 500,000 remounts, and that's for the war that ran from 1899 to 1902, the one where Baden-Powell was involved with Mafeking. Such a high number of horses was needed because of the very high wastage rates. The horses were put to work before they had recovered from their long sea voyages, let alone being given time to adjust to local conditions. They were underfed, overloaded and overworked, and there were no veterinary hospitals to look after them. The wastage rate of horses was put at 120% per annum. But the Remount Service learned from the equine disaster and made changes in its management of horses, especially of those required to travel long distances. Now, whatever the preoccupations of the civilian population in the early 20th century, it was obvious to the political and military hierarchies that war in Europe was likely. The only question being what would be the trigger and when. As part of the general preparedness, the Remount Service had introduced a horse registration scheme, initially comprising 7,000 horses, which could be obtained at agreed prices in the case of need, and subsequently this number was doubled. As time went on, this figure was increased, and it was thought that the army would need 110,000 horses on the outbreak of war. In 1912 and again in 1913, the Army commissioned a full census of horses in the United Kingdom. Sadly, these censuses have not survived. District remount officers were appointed who had to identify the horses that they would want and agree purchase prices for them, so that when the day came, it was simply a matter of collecting them up and paying for them. In the event, 140,000 horses and mules were purchased in 12 days with remarkably little trouble on the outbreak of war. Now, horses and mules were categorized according to build and height, so animals of the required size, etc., could be obtained quickly. As you can see from this list, which I expect half of you can't see because I'm standing in front of it, I'm sorry about that, blame your colleague. There were two categories of riding horses, light and heavy draft horses and pack horses, and there were light draft mules and pack mules. The district remount officers also had to arrange for the care of these animals until they were brought into active service. So the plans not only identified suitable stables, such as racing stables or railway stations, but they even nominated vets whose services would be required, and they had a blacklist of vets whose services would not be required. Just in passing, I should add that in other countries, the Remount Service had responsibilities for donkeys, oxen and camels, but I will not be discussing these because they were not used in Western Europe. Now, there were insufficient horses in Great Britain, so overseas purchases were necessary. Britain bought animals from many countries around the world, but I'm only going to mention North America because I have no evidence that horses or mules came to Romsey from elsewhere. To quote, in North America, horses were bought at sale rings in the Midwest of the USA and early on in Canada. Horses are walked up to the purchaser. Unless immediately rejected, the horse then trotted and examined by a vet. If accepted, put in a pen, and when 7 to 10 animals collected, they are branded. Few men can buy more than 100 a day without laying themselves open to a strong probability of the form deteriorating. So we are dealing with wholesale acquisition of horses. Once bought, the horses were taken by train to the East Coast ports, most commonly Newport News, Boston and New York, in consignments of between 300 and 600 horses. The animals were not allowed to be on a train for more than 36 hours at a stretch, so a series of intermediate remount depot was established where the horses were offloaded, fed and watered between being sent on their way. Before re-embarking, each horse was checked for the disease known as glanders, and any horse with a temperature above 101 degrees Fahrenheit was put aside until it had recovered. At the port, the horses were rested again and given time to recover from their long train journey, and to ensure that they were not suffering from shipping fever, which is a form of equine flu. So it took at least 7 weeks from purchase to shipment of the animals. Once the animals were deemed ready for shipment, they were led on board. To prepare them, their shoes were removed and they were tied up short, partly to protect them in the case of rough weather, and partly to prevent them from fighting amongst themselves, like raiding each other's mangers. There could be up to 1,200 animals on a ship. Each voyage would last 20 days, and from time to time these ships were attacked by German submarines. Now, any of you who are knowledgeable in stable management will already have thought through the implications of keeping 1,000 or so horses below decks for 3 weeks, especially if bad weather resulted in the closing down of the hatches. One commentator said that the cleaning out is carried out under difficulties which have grown more formidable as the voyage has lengthened. Below decks, the atmosphere is heavy and unhealthy, and the fumes of the disinfectants mingle with ammonia gases, which sounds revolting. The horses' diet was restricted during the voyage, but they had to be watered individually from buckets, which was a challenging exercise in rough seas. The reshipment was the responsibility of a conductor who might be a vet and whose bonus depended on the horses arriving alive. Now, the easily accessible records show that most of these ships put in at Liverpool or at Avonmouth, but this is far from a complete picture. Horses for Romsey might have been landed at Avonmouth, particularly in the first year of the war, but after that they were commonly sent to Devonport or sometimes to Southampton. The consignments for Romsey were usually in the order of a few hundred animals at a time. It was normal for men from the remount depot to which the horses were assigned to meet the ship and offload the animals. On one occasion, the party went to Devonport and the ship went to Southampton, but mostly it worked. Having disembarked, the animals were checked by a vet and any unfit put aside. The rest would be loaded onto a train for Romsey. One ship was so late arriving that the party with the horses did not arrive in Romsey till the small hours of the morning, long after Romsey's modest street lighting had been turned off. The rest would be led to a train and loaded into horse wagons for the journey to Romsey. A problem arises. The railway line runs to the north of Romsey, and the remount depot was to the south of the town. I don't know exactly what route was followed between the two, but there was no bypass at that stage, so the animals must have come through the town centre, causing considerable congestion in the narrow streets. On arrival at the depot, the horses were put in isolation for a couple of days, and then they were held in the kraal, which was a series of paddocks where they were again on reduced rations, but were free to lie down, roll around, and generally get over the stress of their long journeys. They spent at least 2 weeks in the kraal. Hence, we are looking at a minimum of 4 months from time of purchase to the time when these animals commenced their training. It seems a long wait for an army desperate for horses, but it kept them alive and healthy, so the time was justified. The kraal was perched on the top of a hill overlooking the Tess Valley, so somewhat exposed to winter winds. To give some protection to the animals, the sides were lined with sacking, which the mules ate. So instead, slabbings or offcuts of tree trunks were used. Once the horses were sufficiently rested, they were taken into the main camp where they were housed in roofed shelters. Apart from grooming and regular exercising, they were shod, dipped against disease, and trained for military service. There was a school of farriery at Romsey Remount Depot where cold shoeing was taught. Now, a word about shoeing. When you're warned, if you have any dealings with horses, not to walk too close to the back of the animal because it may kick you. Mules are much more adaptable. They kick forwards and backwards. So if you wish to shoe a mule, you have to tie its legs together and lay it down, and then you've got a sporting chance of shoeing it without ending up black and blue. And you can see the operation in progress here. Now, the day was highly structured with time to care for and exercise the horses, and each man would look after up to 3 animals, which were exercised in country lanes round and about the camp. The horses received their first feed at 5:30 a.m, with 6 additional feeds during the day, the last one being at about 9 p.m. Their rations would depend on how they were classified. Thus, a heavy draft horse was allocated 15 pounds of oats daily. An officer's charger got 10 pounds, while the lowly pack mule received 6 pounds of oats, amongst other things. Some of them were trained to work in teams, pulling guns, and indeed most of the horses were used in transport rather than as riding animals. They were also used to carry dismantled guns. For example, the Vickers .303 machine gun could be disassembled and carried by 3 horses. The instruction manual shows the parts duly loaded with each horse photographed from each side so that the men would know exactly how to load each horse. And here's one of the 6 pictures. Once the horses were prepared, they were dispatched. Most of them went to France, but some went to other remount depots, and bizarrely, 60 of them were sent to the prisoner of war camp at Stenning in Sussex. More understandably, 6 heavy draft horses were sold for canal work, and of course at this stage canals still form part of the country's transport infrastructure. Now, immediately to the north of Southampton, at Swaithling, there was another remount depot. It had twice the number of men that we had in Romsey, but unlike Romsey, it was not a training camp. Its role was to assemble and dispatch horses for France, at one stage 11,000 a week. Initially, all the horses for France from Romsey were sent to Swaithling and then dispatched from there. But later in the war, horses from Romsey were sent direct to Southampton docks. There was a set of orders for proceeding to the docks, and each man rode one horse and led another. The horses had to be rested before they entered Southampton and ridden to attention through the city. At the docks, the horses were checked by a vet. The usual vet was Captain Alexander Burnfield, a member of the Scottish Highland Regiment. His duties included vetting horses at Southampton before shipment to France, but sometimes a mare was found to be in foal, and these were often taken to his farm at Hazeldown near Stockbridge for safekeeping, and only returned when the foal had been born, but these seem to have remained at Hazeldown. The tale is told that he would drive to Southampton docks in a yellow Model T Ford, and as he was well known there, could not see the point in stopping at the dock gates. The sentries, who all knew who he was, nevertheless had strict orders to shoot at any vehicle which did not stop, and so they used to fire a few rounds at the back of his car, which was consequently peppered with bullet holes. Once the horses had been inspected and those rejected set aside, the rest were watered. They were then led up the brows, which most of us call gangplanks, and tied up. Rugs were put on horses who were on deck. Instructions were given that men were not to resort to violence to persuade the animals to board until all persuasive measures have failed. The ships generally sailed at night so that they would be less obvious to enemy vessels. Sometimes men from Romsey accompanied their horses, and the usual landing places in France were Le Havre, Rouen or Dieppe, where there were remount depots established to receive the animals, and then the men cleaned the boat on the return journey. Just under 500,000 horses and mules were obtained by the British Army in Great Britain, which included Ireland at that date, and over 600,000 from the USA, 1.1 million. Now, so far I've talked about the horses. As I said, at the outbreak of the war, there were 3 remount depots at Woolwich, at Arborfield and at Melton Mowbray, and various civilian establishments where horses were looked after for the remount service, including one run wholly by women. But I'm now going to talk about the depot at Romsey. With the outbreak of war, the remount service had a need for more establishments directly under its own control. And the first one to be decided upon was at Romsey. Land on the Broadlands estate around Randall's farm on Paunceford Hill was commandeered. Sufficient land was obtained for 10 squadrons of men, an army veterinary hospital and an isolation hospital, that's a horse one, not a man one, and as well as the kraal. And the depot was built at a cost of £156,000. Now, the camp consisted of accommodation for 10 squadrons, 5 in the north camp, 5 in the south camp. And looking at this map in a bit of detail, here is the River Test coming, the River Test is off right. This is the road now known as the A3090, which has lost its hiccup in the middle, and is now, you come up the hill from the River Test on a dual carriageway, you go along a plateau at the top, and when you get to here, you descend down the hill to the Hour roundabout, and then you continue straight over that if you're going to see Peppa Pig. But as I said, what you've got is you've got a north camp, a north camp and a south camp. You've got a headquarters unit here, you've got the veterinary hospital there, and the kraal over here. And the isolation hospital down there, well away from everything. So Romsey was an innovative remount depot in that the quarters for the men and the horses that they were looking after were co-located. In other camps, the men were in one place and the horses in another. But it was found in this way that it was much more efficient for the men and much more easy for their, I was going to say managers, that's not military word, but you know what I mean, to keep an eye on what was going on. Now, so we've got horses, we've got premises. What about the men? The commandant for most of the war was Colonel Herbert Jessel, who later was Sir Herbert, and subsequently, in 1924, raised to the peerage as Baron Jessel of Westminster. And he lived on to 1950, when he was 84. He had been an MP for many years. He lost his seat for a bit and then regained it. He was an MP for one of the central London constituencies. So throughout the First World War, he was also an MP. He had 4 officers below him, including a riding master and a vet. Below them came the RSM and a staff sergeant and 14 lesser men, so amounting to 21 in all. They were supported by a chaplain, an RAMC officer, an officer in charge of messing, and a dental officer. These latter people were not attached to the remount depot, but were on detached duty, so don't count in the figures for the establishment. Below the headquarters group, there were the 10 squadrons, each headed by a major, below whom were lesser officers, NCOs and the men, and each squadron had a complement of 201 in all. So the total strength was 2,101 men. By comparison, the population of Romsey was 4,669 in the town, and a further 1,447 in Romsey Extra, which is the rural bits round the town, or just over 6,000 in all. Thus a new town, all youngish male, was created within 2 miles of Romsey at a time when all the local younger men were away at the war. They had a lot less trouble than they might have done. As you can imagine, the officers were primarily men with experience in managing stables. They included older cavalry officers, masters of hunts, and racehorse trainers. I've seen the names of officers and vets, but not those of the other ranks who served there. In all, there seem to have been some 92 officers and 15 vets served at Romsey, not all at the same time. Many of them were there for less than a year, but some stayed for longer, and 1 or 2 served there throughout the whole war, including 5 of the vets, 2 of whom were Mr. Bug and Mr. Rub, respectively. Probably the most famous of the officers was Captain Edwards. Lionel Edwards was a talented artist who is particularly remembered for his drawings and paintings of horses. After Munnings, he is probably the most important sporting artist of the 20th century. He also illustrated many books. If you look him up on Google, you'll be amazed by how much material there is. His daughter Marjorie described how her father was desperate to join up on the outbreak of war, although he was in his mid-30s by then. He was appointed to Romsey Remount Depot in March 1915, which was a very suitable place for a man so versed in equine matters as Edwards. He immediately moved his family from Oxford to Romsey and reported to the camp, where he was told to clear out and wait till sent for. He and his family put up at the White Horse, the town's leading hotel, for the next 6 weeks. They then moved to nearby West Wellow with only a live-in cook to help Mrs. Edwards. I expect she had a daily or 2 as well. Captain Lionel Edwards spent the whole war at Romsey. He not infrequently took parties to Devonport to collect horses. He also arranged for cast, that is discarded horses, to be taken to sales across the south of England or the Midlands. At the end of the war, he played a large part in arranging for the sale of horses before his own discharge in 1920. After the war, the family moved to Buckholt, which is near Stockbridge, in the Mid-Test Valley, and he became a familiar figure at many of the local hunts. It is said that during the Second World War, Edwards ran the only mounted home guard in England. Originally, the men were, like the officers, largely experienced in the management of horses, and the complement included a number of rough riders, mostly Canadians or Australians, who had skill in managing untamed horses. These horses were not docile children's riding horses, they were semi-wild animals, really. Like the officers, men came and went. Often groups of them would be sent to other remount establishments, either in the UK or overseas. For example, in September 1917, 160 privates were sent to France. In 1916, one squadron was told to hold itself in readiness to go to Egypt, and I think were sent there. Not all the men, however, were at home with horses. The West Surrey History Centre has come by letters sent by Private Harry Cobbett to his family in 1915, and they describe his impressions of the Romsey Remount camp. The fact that he was in khaki in 1915, many months before conscription, means that he had volunteered. However, he was not a happy man. In one of his letters, he added a postscript that Romsey Village is a dirty little place, although he liked Romsey Abbey. In one letter he wrote, "Several of our chaps have been knocked out this past week by our horses. We seem to have the worst lot on record. Absolutely savage wild beasts. 3 men are in hospital and some attending. Some of the horses are put in the stocks in order to clean them." In September, when he was very definitely tired of the war, he wrote, "The men here say that one need not go to the front to get wounded. It's done in this camp every day." These accidents, I think, alone justify the existence of the camp hospital. There were also regular dental inspections. Dental work included extractions and the providing and repair of dentures. The figures show rather more extractions than anaesthetics. The medics inspected the men regularly. This was not wholly altruistic, because a man's medical classification could affect whether or not he was posted to the front. And as the war progressed, more and more men were classed A for fitness and could be sent to France. Receiving 4 adequate meals a day did much to improve the fitness of many of the conscripts. By the summer of 1918, the influenza epidemic that was sweeping across Europe affected the camp. About 600 cases were treated at the Romsey Remount depot. In October, the disease was still causing problems, and Totton, Romsey and Southampton were put out of bounds to the troops. But I'm not sure if that's to protect the towns from the troops or the troops from the townspeople. By comparison, the concern of the officers were maintaining discipline. For example, when pay was increased in 1917, the commandant observed that no one got drunk on the night that back pay had been distributed, and so many men sent money home that the camp post office ran out of registered envelopes. And that's something I have to explain to a young audience. And this poem, I think, is exactly right for the Remount service. Why they needed to add a stitching time saves 9 and buck up defeats me. It seems to me over-egging the cake. The men who built the camp had worked an 11-hour day. The soldiers, of course, lived in, and their day was structured throughout the 24 hours. As the camp was woken by Reveille at 5:30 and lights out at 10:15, half an hour later for the sergeants. For most of the men, their day was taken up with the care of horses. But despite the heavy commitment to the care of horses, other activities were arranged. The camp organised various sporting contests with teams entering on a squadron basis, such as boxing matches, football, tug-of-war and rifle shooting, as well as equestrian events. And on one occasion, the profits of £50 from a boxing match were sent to the Submarine Sailors Fund. The camp had a Pierrot concert party which put on shows, and sometimes civilian groups would come from Romsey, Totton or Southampton to entertain the troops. In late 1917, a drill hall was erected next to the recreation hall, and it was used for the showing of films projected onto a 15-foot screen. And of course, these films would have been silent, so there must have been a pianist to accompany them. There were what might be delicately called domestic matters to attend to. There's a limit to how much manure local farmers could use, or the seasons in which they could use it. Therefore, the camp bought 2 incinerators to dispose of the surplus. A number of acres were put aside for growing vegetables. There was, of course, a considerable food shortage in the latter stages of the war, and having their own vegetables, especially potatoes, would enable the camp to be less dependent on increasing market prices. It also provided a useful occupation for the men if they had time on their hands. Now, quite apart from the military personnel, the camp made use of much civilian labour, For example, 21 women were employed on the oil-powered machines that cut up the chaff that was mixed with hay or straw for the horses. And the camp did much of its own cooking in-house. I suspect they employed a good many local women as cooks. They also bought provisions from Romsey because the baker, Mr. Chase, used to tell his delivery men, remember it's 10 to the dozen up at the camp. In addition, the Baptist minister, Reverend E.F.M. Vokes, was a frequent visitor at the camp where he took a major role in the YMCA. Several of the churches in Romsey allowed their church rooms to be used as social clubs by the troops as well. And there were other military camps in the area during the war, including an American one. Now, this plaque was said to have been given to the Congregational Church, which is now the United Reformed Church. But either they've lost it or we've got the wrong church. But either way, I don't know what's become of it, neither does anybody else. Eventually, the war came to an end. Most of the country's remount depots were surplus to requirements. In April 1918, Colonel Jessel was replaced by Colonel Sanders, and the camp became a demob centre. Sanders was known as a strict disciplinarian, which was important in such establishments. I mean, you know what boys are like on their last day at school. Well, soldiers are the same thing writ large, really. The horses were sold, and Captain Edwards played quite a part in taking them from Romsey to various auctions. The camp was completely demolished and the land returned to agricultural use. Mr. Alfred Frampton of Ranville's farm received well over £3,000 to restore his land for farming. In the late 20th century, the land of South Camp was the site of a gravel pit beside Ridge Lane, which was on the western side of the camp. But that activity has now ceased. The whole has been filled in and levelled off and has become a wooden crematorium, which seems very popular locally. Some of the camp buildings were sold. There are stories from many farms in the Romsey area of cattle troughs and other surplus military equipment serving for many years. And one of the huts is still doing duty as part of Minstead Village Hall. What could not be sold was broken up and used as hardcore. And that is where the link with the town's War Memorial Park comes in. As a memorial to those who had fallen in the Great War, it was decided to convert a field owned by the council into a much-needed public park for the town. The field, known as Streetmead, lay between two branches of the River Test, but the ground was seriously waterlogged in all but summer months and not immediately suitable. However, plenty of hardcore was available from the demolished structures of the Remount depot, so the drainage could be improved, and now the lawns of the Memorial Park rest on the remains of Romsey's Remount depot. Bits and pieces of these remains could be seen when a hole was excavated for the foundation of the Warhorse statue. Major General Jack Seeley, who became Lord Mottisstone and for years was Lord Lieutenant of Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, a cavalryman, unveiled the monument on June the 22nd, 1921, and it was his horse Warrior that was the inspiration for the film and play of Warhorse. A group of us came together to create a memorial to the horses who had served in the Great War and to their training camp on the edge of Romsey. It's the only military statue I know where the man is an adjunct to the horse rather than the other way round. The sculptor Amy Goodman created the statue for us, which is in bronze resin and floodlit at night. The statue was unveiled by the Princess Royal in July 2015, a century after the Remount Depot was opened for business. And we had a grand civic occasion with some gorgeous military horses, local school children, the war horse puppet from the National Theatre, and lots of people variously in the marketplace and on the road to the park and in the park. The park gardeners were all presented to the princess amongst other people, and they'd done a superb job in remodelling the entrance part of the park and manicuring it for the day. It was immaculate. Amongst those who attended the ceremony was Nancy Sanders. She was the daughter of that last commandant, Colonel Sanders. She is the only person I have met who has personal memories of the Remount camp. She remembers the camp from the time when the family moved to near Romsey, and she was 101 when this picture of her was taken. She only survived a few months after that. Her nephew reckoned that she stayed alive deliberately to be there. It is easy, though painful, to think of the human suffering endured as a result of the First World War. What I've done in this talk is drawn your attention to the fact that many animals were involved as well, and their contribution is much less well remembered. So thank you for listening.
So I just thought I'd read a few paragraphs from this, which was Milford on Sea and the surrounding area in the First World War. Without the benefits of today's media, most people in Milford of 1914 would have been unaware of the political situation in Europe during the period following the Franco-Prussian War. It is doubtful if they would have known much, if anything, about a country called Bosnia, let alone the significance of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in June 1914. However, it would seem that there may have been an inkling of things to come, as the March issue of the Parish magazine announced that future subjects for the Milford Debating Society, which met fortnightly in the parish room in Barnes Lane, would include that the well-being of the nation requires a scheme of compulsory military service. So, like Romsey, people were beginning to think that things were coming. Now, the important bit, of course, is that there was at least one family in the village that was certainly aware that war clouds could be looming, the Cornwallis Wests, with two daughters who would eventually find themselves on opposite sides. Constance, the Duchess of Westminster, and her older sister, Her Serene Highness Princess Daisy of Pless, living in Germany. Daisy, in her memoirs, recorded that in June 1914 she had received a long letter from Sir Arthur Crossfield concerning the industrial and political situation in Europe. Sir Arthur Crossfield had been a Member of Parliament and had recently sold the family business of soap and candle manufacturing. He was a wealthy man with an interest in the Balkans, and in later years published a book entitled The Settlement of the Near East. In his letter, he begged Daisy to bring to the attention of the German Emperor, in private, his solution to prevent war. Unfortunately, Sir Arthur did not hold any office in the British government. He was only a private person, and Daisy had not seen the Emperor for 5 months. The Kaiser always appeared to enjoy Daisy's company. However, there were always people around him, so Daisy never saw him entirely alone, and no doubt his advisers were suspicious of what an English woman might say. In the event, the circumstances overrode the issue, as whilst she debated how best to act, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife were murdered, and as Daisy wrote, time for words had passed, and the earthquake action of war was at hand. I wonder, and here is a question to us all, what if she had actually been able to speak to the Kaiser? Would things have been changed, or would things have just been delayed for a period? We shall never know. But there you are. That is Milford's connection to the beginning of the First World War.